Imagine lying awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling while the person beside you sleeps peacefully, their breath creating a gentle rhythm that should comfort you but instead amplifies a gnawing question that refuses to be silenced. What if everything you think you know about love is merely a performance? Picture this moment with uncomfortable clarity. You've been together for months, perhaps years, and yet something feels fundamentally incomplete. You go through the motions, the dinners, the conversations, the physical intimacy. But in those vulnerable hours when darkness strips away all pretense, when the mind can no longer hide behind the elaborate theater of daily life, you're confronted with a terrifying possibility: that you've been loving someone who exists only in your imagination, while the real them remains locked away behind walls you didn't even know existed. This isn't about the surface-level behaviors that relationship articles endlessly catalog, the flowers, the compliments, the grand gestures that anyone can learn to perform with enough practice. This is about something far more disturbing and profound: the unconscious language that emerges only when a man's deepest psychological defenses dissolve completely, when his carefully constructed persona crumbles in the sacred space of absolute vulnerability. Carl Jung understood something that modern psychology often overlooks in its rush to categorize and simplify human behavior. He recognized that authentic love operates in a realm beyond conscious intention, beyond the ego's desperate attempts to control and manipulate outcomes. It exists in what he called the collective unconscious, that vast, shared psychic space where our most primitive and profound truths reside, waiting to emerge only when conditions allow for complete psychological nakedness. But here's where the paradox becomes almost unbearable. Most people, even those who believe themselves to be in love, never access this deeper realm. They remain trapped in what Jung termed the persona, the mask we wear to navigate social expectations and protect our fragile sense of self. They mistake the performance of love for love itself, mistaking the shadow dancing on the cave wall for reality. Consider how devastating this realization becomes when you truly absorb its implications. You might have spent years with someone, shared beds and dreams and futures, only to discover that you've never actually met them, and they've never met you. You've been intimate with ghosts, making love to projections, whispering secrets to carefully crafted illusions. What Jung discovered through decades of analyzing the human psyche was that there are specific, unmistakable signals that emerge when a man's deepest psychological barriers finally collapse. These aren't behaviors that can be taught or faked. They're involuntary expressions of the unconscious mind, as revealing as a fingerprint and as unique as DNA. They emerge only in moments of absolute psychological surrender, when the ego's grip loosens enough to allow the authentic self to breathe. The question that should be keeping you awake at night isn't whether your partner loves you according to society's checklist of romantic behaviors. The question is far more unsettling. Has he ever revealed his unconscious self to you? Has he ever dropped so completely into authentic presence that his deepest psychological patterns became visible? Because until that happens, you're not witnessing love, you're witnessing performance. This isn't about technique or skill in the bedroom. This isn't about physical prowess or learned behaviors. This is about those rare moments when the conscious mind steps aside and allows something far more primitive and truthful to emerge, something that Jung recognized as the only genuine indicator of whether someone has surrendered not just their body, but their entire psychic structure to another human being. The implications of this understanding will shatter everything you thought you knew about intimacy, about connection, about the very nature of what it means to be truly known by another person. To understand why authentic love has become so rare, we must first confront an uncomfortable truth about the human condition that Jung spent his life trying to illuminate. We are creatures fundamentally terrified of our own depths. From the moment we develop self-awareness as children, we begin the exhausting process of constructing what Jung called the persona, a psychological mask designed not just to make us acceptable to others, but to make us tolerable to ourselves. This isn't merely about social conformity. This is about existential survival. The raw, unfiltered human psyche contains impulses, desires, and truths so primal and overwhelming that direct exposure to them would shatter our carefully maintained sense of who we are. We learn, often before we can even articulate it, that certain parts of ourselves are dangerous, not just socially unacceptable, but psychologically destabilizing to our very sense of identity. Jung understood that this process creates what he termed the shadow, everything we've rejected, repressed, or refused to acknowledge about ourselves. But here's where most people misunderstand shadow work. The shadow isn't just composed of negative traits. It also contains our deepest capacity for authentic love, raw vulnerability, and genuine connection. We don't just hide our darkness from others. We hide our light as well, because true radiance requires a level of psychological nakedness that feels unbearably dangerous. Friedrich Nietzsche anticipated this psychological insight when he wrote about the herd mentality, the way human beings sacrifice their individual authenticity for the safety of collective approval. But Nietzsche couldn't have foreseen how this would manifest in intimate relationships, where two people can share the same bed for decades while remaining complete strangers to each other's authentic selves. The bedroom becomes the ultimate theater of this deception because it's the space where we're most physically vulnerable, yet paradoxically where we often perform our most elaborate psychological defenses. Sex becomes a performance of intimacy rather than intimacy itself. A carefully choreographed dance designed to maintain the illusion of connection while protecting both partners from the terrifying prospect of being truly seen. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote extensively about what he called the will to live, the unconscious drive that compels all human behavior. But what he recognized, and what Jung later expanded upon, is that this will operates through elaborate systems of self-deception. We convince ourselves that we want connection while simultaneously doing everything possible to avoid the psychological death that authentic connection requires. Consider how this manifests in the most intimate moments between partners. Even during physical union, the mind remains busy constructing narratives, managing impressions, monitoring responses. The ego never stops working, never stops protecting, never stops performing. The result is a kind of existential loneliness that can persist even in the midst of physical intimacy, perhaps especially then, because the contrast between bodily closeness and psychological distance becomes most acute. Viktor Frankl, who understood suffering in ways most cannot fathom, identified meaning as the primary human drive. But what he discovered in the concentration camps applies equally to the bedroom. Meaning emerges only when we stop trying to protect ourselves from life's fundamental uncertainty and instead surrender to something larger than our individual will to survive. Authentic love requires the same kind of surrender, a willingness to die psychologically so that something truer can emerge. Jung's concept of individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are rather than who we think we should be, can only occur when we find someone safe enough to allow our deepest psychological patterns to surface. But here lies the cruel paradox. We can only recognize such safety when we've already begun the process of dropping our defenses, which requires a leap of faith that feels like psychological suicide. The modern world has made this process even more difficult by providing endless distractions from the inner work that authentic relationship demands. We can now avoid the uncomfortable silence where real intimacy emerges by reaching for our phones, turning on the television, or engaging in any number of activities designed to keep the ego busy and the shadow safely buried. Jean-Paul Sartre famously declared that hell is other people. But what he really meant was that other people force us to confront aspects of ourselves we'd rather keep hidden. The bedroom amplifies this dynamic exponentially because it strips away most of our usual defenses while demanding a level of presence that the ego finds unbearable. This is why most intimate relationships eventually settle into patterns of mutual avoidance disguised as familiarity. Partners learn each other's triggers and carefully navigate around them, creating an illusion of harmony that's actually an elaborate system of mutual enabling. They mistake the absence of conflict for the presence of love, not realizing that they've simply become skilled at avoiding the very confrontations that could lead to authentic connection. The price we pay for this elaborate psychological theater extends far beyond the bedroom, seeping into every aspect of our existence like a slow-acting poison that we've learned to call normal life. What Jung recognized, and what modern neuroscience has begun to confirm, is that the human brain literally rewires itself around patterns of authenticity or deception. When we consistently choose self-protection over self-revelation, we don't just miss opportunities for connection, we fundamentally alter our capacity to experience reality itself. Consider the neurological implications of this constant performance. Every time you choose to hide your authentic response, to manufacture an acceptable emotion, or to perform a version of intimacy that feels safe rather than true, Your brain strengthens the neural pathways associated with disconnection while allowing the pathways of genuine feeling to atrophy. You're not just lying to your partner. You're teaching your nervous system to forget what truth feels like. This creates what psychologists call emotional numbing. But the term barely captures the existential horror of the condition. Imagine slowly losing your ability to distinguish between what you actually feel and what you think you should feel, between what you authentically desire and what seems socially acceptable to want. The boundaries between your true self and your performed self begin to blur until you can no longer locate the authentic person beneath the mask. The bedroom becomes ground zero for this psychological erosion because it's where our deepest patterns of connection or disconnection are rehearsed night after night. Each time intimate moments pass without genuine meeting, without the kind of vulnerable presence that Jung associated with psychological wholeness, both partners move further away from their capacity for authentic feeling. They begin to inhabit what could only be called a shared hallucination, a relationship that exists primarily in their projections rather than in present-moment reality. Cultural conditioning amplifies this tragedy by providing endless scripts for how intimacy should look rather than teaching us how to recognize what authentic intimacy actually feels like. We're bombarded with images of performed passion, choreographed vulnerability, and manufactured spontaneity until we lose all reference points for what genuine connection might entail. The result is that many people spend their entire lives searching for something they've been systematically trained not to recognize. The cognitive biases that emerge from this conditioning are particularly insidious. Confirmation bias leads us to interpret ambiguous signals as evidence of love even when they might indicate mere habit or comfort. The sunk cost fallacy keeps us invested in relationships that feel familiar rather than alive. Most destructively, we develop what could be called intimacy blindness, the inability to distinguish between someone who is genuinely present with us and someone who has simply learned to perform presence convincingly. This psychological myopia has profound implications for mental health. Anxiety and depression rates have skyrocketed in direct correlation with our increasing disconnection from authentic feeling and genuine relationship. But what's most tragic is that people often interpret these symptoms as personal failings rather than recognizing them as natural responses to living in constant disconnection from their own truth and from authentic contact with others. The ripple effects extend into every area of life. When you've spent years training yourself to accept performed intimacy as the real thing, you begin to accept performed everything else as well. Friendships become transactional rather than meaningful. Work becomes about image management rather than authentic contribution. Even your relationship with yourself becomes performative. You begin monitoring your own thoughts and feelings according to what seems acceptable rather than what's actually present. Jung warned about this phenomenon, which he called psychological inflation, the ego's attempt to control experiences that can only be received through surrender. When we try to manage intimacy rather than allowing it to emerge naturally, we create relationships based on mutual psychological inflation rather than genuine meeting. Both partners become trapped in maintaining personas that grow increasingly exhausting to sustain. Perhaps most heartbreaking is how this dynamic perpetuates itself across generations. Children growing up in households where intimacy is performed rather than genuine learn to distrust their own instincts about connection. They develop sophisticated radar for detecting what adults want to hear while losing touch with their own authentic responses. By the time they enter their own intimate relationships, they've already been conditioned to choose safety over truth, comfort over growth, predictability over the terrifying beauty of genuine encounter. The ultimate consequence of this systematic avoidance of authentic intimacy is a kind of existential loneliness that no amount of social connection can remedy. You can be surrounded by people who claim to love you, who perform all the right behaviors and say all the expected words, while remaining fundamentally alone in your experience. The tragedy is that most people learn to call this normal, even healthy, because they've never experienced anything different. This is the hidden epidemic of our time. Not the absence of relationships, but the presence of relationships that feel full while leaving us empty, that promise connection while delivering isolation, that offer the appearance of love while withholding its transformative essence. But what if everything you've been taught about love and intimacy is not just wrong, but deliberately designed to keep you trapped in cycles of performed connection that serve everyone's comfort while nourishing no one's soul? What if the path to authentic intimacy requires not learning new techniques or strategies, but rather unlearning everything you think you know about how love is supposed to work? The rebellion begins with a radical act that will feel like psychological suicide. You must be willing to be completely disliked, misunderstood, and rejected for who you actually are rather than loved and accepted for who you pretend to be. This isn't about becoming deliberately difficult or confrontational. It's about developing the courage to let your authentic responses emerge without immediate editing, even when those responses challenge your partner's comfort or your own carefully maintained self-image. Jung called this process holding the tension of the opposites. The ability to remain present with contradictory feelings and impulses without immediately resolving them into something more palatable. In intimate moments, this means allowing yourself to feel simultaneously vulnerable and powerful, loving and angry, deeply connected and utterly alone. Most people rush to resolve these tensions because they feel unbearable, but Jung recognized that authentic intimacy lives precisely in the space between these opposites. Consider what this looks like practically. Instead of performing the passion you think your partner wants to see, you allow whatever is actually present to emerge, even if that's uncertainty, sadness, or a kind of raw tenderness that has no words. Instead of manufacturing responses that maintain the illusion of perfect connection, you risk the terrifying honesty of saying, "I don't know how I feel right now," or "Something in me is afraid of you seeing this." The historical examples of those who broke free from conventional intimacy patterns reveal a common thread. They all developed what could be called sacred selfishness, the willingness to honor their authentic experience, even when it disappointed others' expectations. Rainer Maria Rilke wrote to his wife about the necessity of loving each other's solitude, rather than trying to merge or possess. His relationship became a laboratory for exploring how two people could remain utterly themselves while creating something together that neither could access alone. This kind of intimacy requires developing what Jung termed psychological differentiation, the ability to know where you end and another person begins. Most people mistake emotional fusion for love, losing themselves in their partner's moods and needs while expecting their partner to regulate their own emotional states. True intimacy, paradoxically, requires becoming so grounded in your own experience that you can remain present with another person's authentic responses without taking them personally or trying to change them. The most counterintuitive aspect of this rebellion is that it requires becoming selfish in service of becoming genuinely generous. You must learn to take full responsibility for your own emotional experience so that your partner doesn't have to walk on eggshells around your reactions. You must develop the capacity to be triggered without making your trigger your partner's problem. This isn't emotional suppression, it's emotional sovereignty. In the bedroom, this translates to a complete reversal of conventional wisdom. Instead of focusing on performance or technique, you learn to track the subtle movements of your own nervous system, the waves of opening and closing, the moments when authentic desire arises versus when you're manufacturing it to meet expectations. You become curious about your partner's authentic responses rather than trying to produce specific reactions in them. This requires developing what could be called erotic meditation, the ability to remain present with whatever is arising in intimate moments without immediately trying to change, fix, or optimize the experience. You learn to distinguish between the ego's agenda for how intimacy should unfold and the deeper intelligence that emerges when you stop trying to control outcomes. The most challenging aspect of this rebellion is that it often initially makes relationships less comfortable rather than more fulfilling. When you stop performing familiar roles, your partner may feel confused, threatened, or abandoned. They may pressure you to return to previous patterns because your authenticity challenges their own defenses. This is where most people retreat back into comfortable performance rather than risking the temporary chaos that authentic transformation requires. But those who persist through this difficult transition discover something that most people never experience: the profound relief of being loved for who they actually are rather than who they pretend to be. They discover that vulnerability, rather than being a weakness to manage, is actually the gateway to a kind of intimacy that nourishes rather than depletes, that generates energy rather than consuming it. The ultimate rebellion is realizing that you don't need your partner's permission to be authentic. You only need the courage to risk being disliked for your truth rather than loved for your performance. This shift in priority changes everything. because it transforms you from someone trying to get love to someone capable of giving it authentically. Now we arrive at the truth that Jung spent his entire life trying to articulate, the realization that makes everything else fall into place with crystalline clarity. Authentic love is not something that happens between two people. It's something that happens through them when they become transparent enough to allow the deeper currents of existence to flow without obstruction. The 4 behaviors that Jung identified as unmistakable signs of deep love are not techniques or strategies that can be learned. They are involuntary expressions of what happens when a man's ego dissolves enough to allow his authentic self to breathe. They emerge naturally when someone has developed the courage to be psychologically naked, when the exhausting performance of persona finally gives way to the relief of genuine presence. First, there is the quality of presence that Jung called active imagination. Moments when his ordinary consciousness steps aside and allows something larger to move through him. In intimate moments, this manifests as a kind of listening that extends beyond words, beyond the surface content of what's happening, into the deeper currents of what wants to emerge between two people. You can recognize this presence because it feels both utterly personal and somehow universal, as if you're being seen not just as an individual but as an expression of something eternal. Second, there is what Jung termed shadow integration, the willingness to allow his least acceptable impulses and desires to surface without immediate censorship or control. This doesn't mean acting out destructively, but rather creating space for the full spectrum of human experience to be acknowledged and honored. When a man has truly integrated his shadow, his intimate expressions carry a quality of dangerous authenticity that feels both thrilling and safe. Dangerous because it's unpredictable, safe because it's completely genuine. Third, there is the phenomenon Jung called active receptivity, the capacity to receive his partner's authentic self without trying to change, fix, or improve it. This is perhaps the rarest quality in intimate relationship because it requires developing enough inner security to remain present with experiences that might challenge your own comfort or desires. You can recognize this quality because it creates a field of acceptance so complete that your own defenses begin to dissolve without conscious effort. Fourth, and most powerfully, there is what Jung identified as transcendent union. Moments when individual consciousness gives way to something that could only be called sacred. These are the times when the ordinary boundaries between self and other become permeable, when intimate connection becomes a doorway into experiences that feel larger than personal psychology. This isn't about losing yourself in another person. It's about finding something through intimate connection that neither person could access alone. These 4 qualities cannot be performed or mimicked because they emerge from a fundamental reorganization of consciousness itself. They are the natural expression of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming fully yourself while simultaneously recognizing your deep interconnection with all existence. They represent a kind of psychological maturity that most people never develop because it requires facing everything about yourself that you've spent your life trying to avoid. But here's the ultimate paradox that makes everything else comprehensible. These qualities only emerge when you stop trying to create them. They are the natural result of developing such complete integrity with your own experience that you no longer need to manage or control how others respond to you. They arise spontaneously when you become more interested in truth than in being loved, more committed to authenticity than to comfort, more devoted to growth than to security. The deepest realization is that love, in its most authentic form, is not an emotion or a feeling. It's a quality of consciousness that becomes available when you stop trying to get something from others and instead become a conduit for something larger to flow through you. It's what happens when you develop enough inner security to risk complete vulnerability, enough self-knowledge to offer your authentic gifts, enough wisdom to receive another person's truth without taking it personally. This is why Jung insisted that individuation, becoming who you truly are, is not a selfish pursuit but the most generous gift you can offer the world. When you stop performing love and start embodying it, when you stop trying to get your needs met through others and start meeting life directly, you become capable of intimacy that transforms rather than merely comforts, that challenges rather than enables, that opens doorways to experiences that most people never imagined possible. The ultimate truth is that the love you've been searching for outside yourself has been waiting inside you all along, not as a feeling to be cultivated but as a quality of being to be uncovered. And when you finally stop performing and start being, when you finally risk everything for the sake of truth, you discover that authentic love is not something you fall into. It's something you rise into, something you become, something that transforms not just your relationships but your entire relationship with existence itself.